I've watched enough men break quietly. I've seen them smile through the fractures, hold themselves together with obligation and silence, convinced that endurance is the same thing as strength. I used to think I was different. I used to think I had built something real, something worth keeping. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. But I was never wrong about what I saw on that Friday night in June, under the white tent lights of my son's graduation party, when my wife of 22 years pressed her body against another man's chest and closed her eyes like she was finally home. Let me start at the beginning, though, because what happened that night didn't come from nowhere, even if it felt that way. My name is Andrew Calloway. I'm 53 years old. I spent 26 years in the United States Army, retired as a lieutenant colonel with a chest full of ribbons and a knee that predicts rain better than any meteorologist. I am not, by nature, an emotional man. I was raised in rural Tennessee by a father who communicated primarily through silence and a mother who made every hard thing look survivable. I learned to observe before I spoke. I learned to verify before I trusted. I learned that the truth, however painful, was always preferable to a comfortable lie. Those lessons served me well in uniform. I thought they served me well at home. Mary Calloway, née Bradford, was a colonel in the United States Army Medical Corps when we met at Fort Bragg 23 years ago. She was sharp, composed, impossibly capable. She had the kind of bearing that made rooms straighten up. I was a major then, attached to the 82nd Airborne, and I thought I'd seen everything worth seeing in this world. Then I met Mary at a unit social, standing by the drink table in her dress uniform with her hair pinned back and her eyes doing this thing where they assessed everything without appearing to. I introduced myself, she looked at me for exactly 3 seconds longer than was polite, and by the end of the evening I had her number and a certainty in my chest that felt almost military in its precision. We married 14 months later. Our son, James, was born 2 years after that. We built a life. We moved 11 times in 20 years. We survived deployments, distance, the particular grinding loneliness of a household that runs on 2 careers that both demand everything. James grew up watching us adapt. He grew up knowing that home wasn't a place, it was an agreement between 2 people. At least, that was what I believed. James graduated from the University of Virginia that spring with a degree in mechanical engineering and an offer from a defense contractor in Northern Virginia. He was 20 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches, broad across the shoulders, with Mary's cheekbones and my stubbornness. We were proud. We were both genuinely, completely proud. I had rented the event space at a local inn just outside Charlottesville, had arranged catering, had coordinated with James's friends and their families, had handled every logistical detail the way I handle all things. Methodically. Completely. With the kind of care that looks like control from the outside but is actually just love expressed in the only vocabulary I've ever been fluent in. Mary had seemed distracted in the days leading up to the party. I noticed, but I filed it under stress. She was finalizing her own retirement papers. 30 years was enough, she had said. She wanted to consult, to travel, to breathe differently. I had supported that. I thought we were on the same page. I was always thinking we were on the same page. The party was on a Friday evening. 63 guests. James was glowing. His friends were loud and happy, exactly the way 20-year-olds should be at the beginning of everything. My old colleague Dennis and his wife drove up from Richmond. James's girlfriend, a quiet, bookish girl named Ellie, stayed close to James all evening with her hand in his. There was a band. There was dancing. There was the kind of noise that happiness makes when it's not performing. I was at the bar talking to Dennis about nothing in particular, bourbon in hand, feeling that rare thing where I was actually relaxed, when I noticed the man come in. He was tall, 50-something. Still had the posture of a military man, though he wore civilian clothes, an open collar shirt and jacket that said he'd made money since leaving service. He scanned the room in that practiced way that veterans do, and when his eyes found Mary, his whole face changed. Mary was across the room talking to James's engineering professor. She had her back to the door. The men moved toward her, and something in the deliberateness of his movement made the back of my neck do what it used to do in country, that low-frequency alertness that precedes threat recognition. Mary turned before he reached her. She turned as though she'd sensed him, and the expression on her face in the half-second before she composed herself was not surprise. It was relief. It was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting. I watched her reach up and hug him. A long hug. Both arms. Her face turned into his shoulder. Dennis kept talking. I kept making sounds that passed for responses. I didn't know the man. I had never seen him before. I knew every significant person in Mary's life because that is what 22 years of marriage looks like. You know the names. You know the histories. You know who matters. This man was none of the names I knew. I excused myself from Dennis and moved through the crowd, not directly toward them. I know how to approach a position. I came from the left, where the noise was higher, where I could observe without announcing myself. I got close enough to hear. His name, it turned out, was Thomas Wren. I heard Mary say it, in a voice she used when saying something important to someone she didn't want to perform for. She said his name and then she said, "You came," and the way she said those two words told me everything about the sentence they came from. This was not the tone of someone greeting a friend. This was the tone of someone receiving something they'd asked for. They talked for longer than was appropriate. I circulated. I shook hands and accepted congratulations and watched my son make his rounds and let the evening carry itself. And I watched Mary and Thomas Wren with the measured attention of someone who has spent decades learning that what you see is rarely everything and what you feel is rarely wrong. At 9:15, the band shifted into something slow. The floor opened up for couples, and I was moving toward Mary to ask her to dance when Thomas Wren extended his hand to her first. She took it. She let him lead her to the floor. And what happened next is the thing I cannot unsee. She stepped into him. Not the careful, appropriate distance of former acquaintances or old colleagues. She stepped all the way in. His hand went to the small of her back. Her head went to his shoulder. Her eyes closed. And she stayed there, in the middle of my son's graduation party, surrounded by 63 people, dancing with a man I had never heard of like the room and everyone in it had ceased to exist. I stood with my bourbon glass and I watched my wife disappear into another man's arms, and the feeling that moved through me was not rage, not yet. It was something colder and more precise. It was the feeling of a scope aligning, of a target becoming clear. I set my glass down on the nearest table and I walked outside. I stood in the parking lot for 4 minutes. I counted them. I have always had the ability to go very still when things are falling apart. The stillness is not peace. It's processing. The brain needs quiet to do the kind of work that matters. 4 minutes was enough to know that I was not overreacting. 4 minutes was enough to know that the hug, the tone, the dance, the closed eyes were not imagination. 4 minutes was enough to know that whatever this was, it had a history that I had not been permitted to witness. I went back inside with a different face than the one I walked out with. Nobody noticed. I've been putting on faces for decades. The party ended at 11. Thomas Wren left at 10:30 after a goodbye that included Mary touching his arm twice and him leaning in to say something quiet into her ear that made her duck her head in the particular way she does when she's touched. I know that gesture. I have been the cause of it exactly 14 times in 22 years, all in the early part of our marriage. I stopped being the cause of it somewhere around year 8, and I had attributed that to the natural settling of long commitment. I had been a fool. On the drive home, I asked her who Thomas Wren was. She said he was an old friend from her early career, someone she'd served with at Walter Reed years ago. She said it smoothly. She said it the way you say things you've already decided on, sentences that have been constructed and reinforced against interrogation. I recognized the architecture of a prepared answer because I have, in my career, listened to a great many of them. I said, that was a long dance, and she said, he's a good dancer, and she turned to look out the passenger window, and that was the end of the conversation. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside her in the dark and I made a plan. The next morning I told her I had some administrative loose ends to handle with my retirement accounts, that I would be at the library and then running errands, that I would be back for dinner. She said fine without looking up from her coffee. I drove to a hotel business center and I sat down at a computer and I started pulling every thread I could find. Thomas Wren. I found him in 30 minutes. It takes less time to find someone than most people imagine, and it takes even less time if you know what databases to look at and what cross-references to follow. Thomas Wren had retired from the Army 7 years ago as a colonel, Medical Corps. He had served at Walter Reed. He had served at Fort Sam Houston. He had served at Landstuhl in Germany. He was now a private healthcare consultant based in Atlanta. He and Mary had served together at Walter Reed. That much was true. What she hadn't mentioned was when, 16 years ago, the same year James was 4 years old, the year I was on my second deployment to Afghanistan, the year Mary had been alone in Northern Virginia for 11 months with a toddler and a career and presumably her grief and loneliness and this man who apparently understood her in a way that made her close her eyes on a dance floor in front of her family 22 years later. I drove to the library and used their printer. Then I called my son. James met me at a coffee shop near his apartment at noon. He could tell from my voice on the phone that something was wrong, because he is his father's son, and we both know when a thing is not right. I told him I needed him to be honest with me. I told him I'd seen something the previous evening that concerned me, and I needed to know what he knew. James was quiet for a long moment. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. He looked at me the same way he's looked at me since he was a boy when he was about to say something hard, with his chin slightly forward and his eyes direct. He told me that about 3 months before the graduation, he had walked in on his mother having a phone call in the kitchen late at night, a call she ended quickly when she heard him come down the stairs. He told me he hadn't made anything of it at the time. He told me that 2 weeks before the graduation, he had borrowed her phone to look up a restaurant address and had seen a text chain with a contact saved only as TW that he'd scrolled past without fully reading, but that the tone of what he'd glimpsed was not the tone of a professional contact. He told me he had told himself it was nothing because he hadn't wanted it to be something. I thanked him. I told him that whatever happened next was not his fault and not his concern to carry. I told him that his graduation was a genuine achievement and that no adult mistake would ever touch the pride I had in him. He nodded. He looked like he was 17 again for just a moment, before he pulled it back. I told him I loved him and I left. I spent Sunday doing things very carefully. First, I called our attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt who had handled our estate planning for a decade and who I trusted entirely. I told her I needed to discuss a sensitive matter on Monday morning and asked if she had time. She made time. Second, I made a list of every joint financial account, every asset, every investment account, every retirement fund, every property, every debt. I did this from memory and then verified it against the documents in our home office, which I had quiet access to because Mary was visiting her sister in Richmond for the day, a habit she'd established in recent months that I had accepted at face value. Third, I called Dennis. He is a retired CID investigator who now does private consulting, and he is one of the few people I would trust with a thing like this. I told him what I had, what I suspected, and what I needed verified. He told me he would make some calls. Dennis called me back Sunday evening while Mary was making dinner. I took the call in the garage. What Dennis told me took 4 minutes and confirmed everything. Thomas Wren had flown from Atlanta to Charlottesville for one night. He had booked a room at the same inn where I had hosted the graduation party. He had no other professional or personal connection to Charlottesville that Dennis could identify. He had not been invited to the party by James. He had not, as far as Dennis could determine, been introduced to a single other guest except through Mary. He had come because she had asked him to come. He had stood in the room where I celebrated my son's achievement and danced with my wife, and every person in that room had watched it happen, and I had been the last to understand what they were watching. I went back inside. I ate dinner with Mary. I complimented the chicken. She told me about her sister's new garden. I said the right things. I was very calm. I have been trained to be calm in conditions that would undo most people, and I used that training at my own dinner table. After dinner she went to read. I sat in my office with the door closed and I made the rest of my decisions. Monday morning I was in Patricia Holt's office by 8:30. Patricia is practical in the way that good lawyers always are. She did not express sympathy or shock. She listened, she asked precise questions, she took notes, and at the end of an hour she gave me a clear picture of what I could do, how long it would take, and what it would cost. Virginia is an equitable distribution state, which means assets are divided fairly but not necessarily equally, and the conduct of the parties can, in some circumstances, be considered. Patricia told me to gather documentation and to be patient, that doing this correctly was more important than doing it quickly. I told her that I agreed and that I also needed to move on one specific thing immediately, our joint savings account, which held money I had inherited from my father's estate 2 years ago, money that was demonstrably separate property that had been commingled without a formal agreement. Patricia made a call. By noon on Monday, I had removed my inheritance from the joint account and transferred it to a new individual account that Mary had no access to or knowledge of. Patricia had reviewed and confirmed the transfer was legally clean. Next I called the financial advisor who managed our investment portfolio. I had a meeting with him at 2 o'clock Monday afternoon. I restructured my contributions, separated the accounts I had established prior to marriage, and established a clear paper trail distinguishing my retirement assets from the marital pool. Everything I did was within my legal rights. Everything I did was documented and handled through proper channels. By 4 o'clock Monday I had also met with an IT professional and changed every password on every personal account, every email, every financial platform, every service. I set up new accounts under a new email address that I had created that morning. I was systematic. Monday evening I called James. I told him what I had learned and what I was doing. I told him he needed to hear it from me and not from circumstance. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry," and I told him he had nothing to be sorry for, that he was the one thing in this situation that was entirely uncomplicated, and that I was proud of him and he should focus on his new job. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I would be. That was the truest thing I said all week. By Tuesday morning I had the divorce papers drawn up. Patricia had moved efficiently, with the understanding that I wanted the process initiated formally before Mary learned what I had done. This mattered to me. I did not want to give her the opportunity to preempt or perform contrition or restructure the narrative. I had spent 22 years in a relationship where, it now appeared, the narrative had been selectively managed, and I wanted the record to be clear about who acted first and why. Tuesday afternoon I asked Dennis to verify one more thing. I needed to know how long this had been going on, not out of a need to punish myself with specifics, but because the duration would determine how I framed my understanding of my own marriage, and I am a person who needs to understand things completely in order to move through them. What Dennis came back with, by Tuesday evening, was this. Based on the digital record he was able to access through legitimate public and professional means, Thomas Wren and Mary had maintained contact through a third-party messaging application that was not her primary phone. She had a second phone, a fact I had not known. The contact, based on what was publicly linkable, appeared to date back at least 14 months, possibly longer. 14 months. James had been a junior in college. I had been attending my own retirement ceremonies. I had been standing at a podium accepting a flag and having my insignia removed and thinking about the next chapter of my life with my wife. I allowed myself 30 minutes in a parking garage on Tuesday evening to feel what I felt. I did not perform this. Nobody was watching. I simply sat in the car and let it move through me, the grief of it, the absurdity of it, the specific cruelty of being deceived by someone you trusted entirely. I let it come and I let it go and I drove home. Wednesday morning I had breakfast on the table at 7, the way I always did. Orange juice, toast, eggs over medium, coffee the way she takes it. She came downstairs in her robe and sat down and said good morning and picked up her coffee and I watched her for a moment and then I said her name. She looked up. I said, I need to tell you some things and I need you to listen without speaking until I'm finished. The color changed in her face. Not guilt, not yet. Just the animal recognition that something is coming. I told her what I had seen at the graduation party. I told her about Thomas Wren, about the dance, about what I had observed in her face when she saw him come in, about what James had told me about the phone call and the texts. I told her I knew Thomas Wren had flown specifically to be at that party, that he had no other reason to be in Charlottesville, and that he had not been invited by her son. I told her I knew about the second phone. I told her I knew the contact went back at least 14 months. I told her the divorce papers had been filed the previous afternoon. I watched her absorb that last sentence like a physical blow. She put the coffee cup down. She opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at me with an expression that I had never seen on her face in 22 years, a specific, stripped-down version of herself with nowhere to arrange her features. She said, Andrew. I said I would like to hear the truth now, if she wanted to offer it. What followed was the kind of conversation that leaves marks. She did not deny Thomas Wren. She said it was complicated. I said I was familiar with the word and that it didn't mean what people used it to mean, that complicated was what you called a thing when you wanted to avoid calling it what it was. She said she hadn't meant for any of it to happen. I said that was probably true and also completely irrelevant. She said she loved me. I said that word had recently lost considerable precision in this conversation. She told me that Thomas Wren had been a significant person in her life before me, someone she'd had a relationship with during her time at Walter Reed, before we met. They had ended it when I had appeared, or so she had framed it at the time. And then 14 months ago, she said, he had reached out, said he was going through a divorce himself, and they had reconnected in a way that she said she had not intended to become what it became. I asked her directly if the relationship had been physical in the past 14 months. She looked at the table. I had my answer. I told her that I had removed my inheritance from our joint account, which was legally my separate property, and that Patricia Holt would be in touch about the formal proceedings. I told her that I would be staying with Dennis in Richmond for the next 2 weeks while the initial legal logistics were arranged, and that she should use the time to make whatever decisions she needed to make about where she wanted to be. She began to cry then. Real crying, not performed, the kind that folds a person's face. I watched it and I felt something that surprised me, which was not coldness and not satisfaction and not grief, but something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after a long confusion, when the thing you were trying to understand finally stands still long enough to be seen. I told her I was sorry this was how it ended. I meant that. I was sorry, not for ending it, but for the wasted years of not knowing what I had been living inside. I was out of the house by noon. In the days that followed, I moved through the necessary architecture of disentanglement. I was calm. I was precise. I was, in the private hours, sometimes neither of those things, and those hours I gave to whatever they needed to be, alone, without witness, and then I put them away and continued. Word traveled the way it does in military communities, which is to say quickly and completely. The network that I had built over 26 years of service operated on trust and truth, and I had been in it long enough that people wanted to know what had happened and were not satisfied with vague answers. I did not spread the story. I did not need to. I told the truth to the people who asked me directly, and I told it without embellishment or cruelty, and I let the facts perform whatever function facts perform. Thomas Wren, I discovered through Dennis a few weeks later, had a daughter who was a junior officer currently serving. That information moved through certain channels in the way that information does. I did not direct it. I did not need to. The military community has its own relationship with personal conduct, particularly the conduct of senior officers who carry the weight of example by virtue of their rank, and Mary had worn eagles on her shoulders, and that meant something, and people decided for themselves what it meant in light of what they now knew. I also learned, 3 weeks after leaving the house, that Thomas Wren had ended contact with Mary shortly after the divorce filing became known to him. This was, in Dennis's words, consistent with a pattern in his recent history, a man who sought reconnection and retreated from consequence. I felt nothing in particular about this. I had not expected better from him and had no investment in his choices. What I did notice, and what I allowed myself to register, was that Mary, having made choices that cost her a 22-year marriage, had also lost the men she had made those choices for. The architecture of what she had destroyed was visible now, and I made no effort to help her not see it. I spent my first weeks in Richmond differently than I expected. I had anticipated a kind of hollow grief, the particular emptiness of a house that should have people in it. Instead, I found something I hadn't had in longer than I could accurately remember, silence that belonged to me, mornings that I could structure however I wanted, coffee that I made exactly as I liked it, which was different from how I'd made it for 2 decades because her preferences had quietly absorbed mine so gradually I hadn't noticed the original version of my own habit. Dennis's guest room was clean and small and faced east, and I slept better than I had in years. I did not analyze this immediately. I let it be a fact and moved on. James came to Richmond for a weekend 3 weeks after I moved out. He brought Ellie. We ate crabs on the dock at a place Dennis recommended and drank cold beer and talked about his new job and her dissertation and the apartment they were looking at in Arlington. They held hands across the table. He looked at her the way I had once looked at his mother, with that particular attentiveness of someone who is still surprised and pleased by the person in front of them. I watched my son be happy and uncomplicated in the middle of a thing that had fractured his family, and I felt something that I want to name correctly, not peace, not yet, but the first structural supports of peace, the early scaffolding of a life that had room in it again for what was real. He asked me, at the end of the weekend, what I was going to do next. He meant practically, career, location, plans. I told him I had been looking at a consulting role with a defense analysis firm based in Washington, something that would use my expertise without requiring me to be anywhere I didn't choose to be. I told him I had also, for the first time since I left Tennessee at 18 years old, been thinking about what I actually wanted from a life that was now, structurally and completely, my own. He nodded. He said, "I think you're going to be okay, Dad." I didn't tell him that I already knew that. He needed to arrive at the conclusion himself. He's 20 years old. He's allowed to be the one who says the thing, even if his father already knows it. The divorce proceedings moved through the Virginia court system with the grinding momentum of legal process. Patricia was methodical and excellent. Mary retained her own attorney, a woman who was competent and professional, which I was glad of because I did not want the process to be anything other than orderly. There were negotiations and adjustments and the inevitable tension of dividing a life into columns. I approached it the way I approach most difficult things, with patience, with documentation, and without sentiment where sentiment would cost me position. There were phone calls from Mary during that period. I answered them when they concerned legal or logistical matters. When they did not, I did not answer them. She sent one letter, handwritten, 3 pages, which I read once and set aside. I understood what she was trying to say and I believed that she meant it, which is to say I believed that she was experiencing real remorse, and I also believed that remorse is not the same as reparation, and that the question of what she felt was now, structurally, no longer a question that involved me. I wrote her one letter in return, 2 paragraphs. I told her that I hoped she found her way to a version of her life that she could be honest about, because I believed that the concealment had cost her as much as it had cost me, in different ways. I told her that James was a testament to the fact that we had done something right together, and that I would always respect that. I told her I wished her well in terms I meant. I did not send her anything else. The defense analysis firm offered me a position 4 months after I left the house. I accepted it. The work was interesting in the way that good problems are always interesting, and it put me in rooms with people who thought carefully about consequential things, which is the environment I had lived in for 26 years and apparently needed more than I had realized. I found an apartment in Alexandria, clean lines, 4th floor, a view of the Potomac on clear days. I furnished it without anyone else's preferences to accommodate, which was a strange and not unpleasant experience. I bought a couch I liked without considering whether she would like it. I hung things on walls. I cooked things I wanted to eat. I went to bed when I was tired. These are ordinary freedoms that most people take for granted, and I had not had them for so long that recovering them felt like learning a language I had once spoken and almost forgotten. I went back to the gym with a consistency I hadn't managed in years. Not for any external reason, but because physical discipline is the fastest way I know to remind myself of my own capability. There is something clarifying about a body that responds to what you demand of it. I ran 4 miles every morning along the river path. I slept 8 hours. I read things I chose to read. I called James on Sundays. Gradually, without drama, I rebuilt. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Dennis called to tell me that Mary had left Virginia. She had accepted a consulting position in Texas and relocated. Thomas Wren, it appeared, had not followed her or sought to. She was, by Dennis's account from mutual acquaintances, starting over in a city where she didn't have the weight of her reputation to carry differently than she'd imagined. I registered this information and moved on with my afternoon. What I will tell you is this: I did not enjoy her difficulty the way I had anticipated I might. In the early days after leaving the house, when the anger was still hot and specifically shaped, I had imagined a satisfaction in her suffering that I thought I deserved. But somewhere in the months that followed, the anger became something less consuming and what remained was not satisfaction but simply distance. The appropriate, clean distance of a person who had completed a chapter and was writing the next one without reference to the previous. Justice, I have come to understand, does not always announce itself with the satisfying violence of a verdict. Sometimes it's simply the quiet fact of your own good life, running parallel to the choices that someone else made, diverging at the point of their dishonesty, and continuing in a direction they will not be able to follow. About 10 months after the divorce finalized, I ran into someone at a conference in Arlington. Her name was Christine Vance, a retired Air Force colonel who was consulting in international security policy. We were introduced over coffee by a mutual colleague and discovered within 20 minutes that we had the following in common: a former life entirely consumed by service, a marriage that had not survived the transition to civilian life, adult children we were proud of, and a very specific, well-calibrated intolerance for wasted time. Christine was funny in the dry, observational way that people with long military careers tend to be, having survived enough bureaucratic absurdity that irony becomes a native language. She had silver in her dark hair that she made no effort to manage. She said what she thought. She listened to what other people said with the kind of attention that made you feel the conversation was actually happening, rather than two people waiting for their turn. We had dinner 3 days after the conference. I was honest about where I was and where I'd been. She was equally honest. We were both people who had arrived, through different routes, at the same understanding, that the architecture of a relationship should be what it appears to be from the inside and the outside both, that the space between a person's private self and their visible self should be as small as possible, because the gap is always where the damage happens. We were not in a hurry. We didn't need to be. Now it is 2.5 years since the night of James's graduation party. I am sitting on the 4th-floor balcony of my apartment in Alexandria with my coffee and the morning paper, and I am going to tell you what the accounting looks like from here. James is thriving. He proposed to Ellie in November with a ring that he picked out without asking me for help, which told me everything I needed to know about his confidence. They are getting married in September. He asked me to be his best man, and when he asked I had to look at the river for a moment before I could answer. My work is good. It uses what I built over 26 years and asks me to build further, which is the right relationship to have with what you know. I am respected in the rooms I sit in, and I have earned that respect through the same means I always have, by being precisely what I present myself to be. Christine and I are taking a trip to Portugal in the fall, after James's wedding. It will be the first time I have traveled without a professional reason or a military order in my adult life. I am told Lisbon is beautiful in a specific way that takes some time to understand. I am prepared to take the time. And what of Mary? I hear, through the peripheral connections that survive divorce in a small community, that she is in Texas, that she is working, that she is, as far as anyone can tell, managing. I do not ask for more detail than that. I do not think about her in the early morning the way I used to, that involuntary habit of a life shared, where the other person was the first thought before consciousness fully assembled itself. She has been replaced in that slot by the river and the coffee and the things I intend to do with the day. I don't carry resentment. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story ends with bitterness as the evidence of injury, and I am not interested in easy or in bitterness. What I carry instead is a very clear understanding of what I will and will not accept, an understanding I did not have in the same way before, because I had not needed to test it. The thing about betrayal is that it reveals a map. It shows you, finally and completely, the actual terrain of where you were living, not the terrain you believed in, not the terrain that was presented to you, but the real ground. And yes, the real ground was different from what I'd been told, and yes, that cost me something I will never entirely stop being aware of having lost. But the map also shows you where you are now. And where I am now is not a place that has been drawn by someone else's decisions or shaped by another person's concealment. Where I am now is mine. I made it mine in the 4 minutes I stood in a parking lot under June stars, with a bourbon glass on someone else's table and my wife's eyes closed against another man's shoulder. I made it mine in the days and weeks that followed, in every deliberate, documented, legally careful step of disentanglement. I made it mine in the mornings in Dennis's guest room, in the miles along the river, in the couch I chose without consultation, in the conversations with James that got easier and more honest as the false architecture of the previous chapter came fully down. The night of the graduation, I walked out of that party a man who did not yet know the full shape of what he was dealing with. I walked back in with a different face. I walked out again, 2 days later, never having raised my voice, never having allowed chaos into what needed to be clean, and I began the process of ending one life and starting another with the same precision and care I brought to every significant operation I ever ran. Before sunrise on the morning I left that house, I stood in the kitchen where I had eaten 22 years of breakfasts and I looked at the room the way you look at a place you will not return to. I did not feel sorry for leaving. I felt, if I am being precise, the specific and unmistakable sensation of a chapter closing, of a door being shut cleanly from the outside, of the next thing beginning. I took my coffee cup, the one I'd bought for myself the year I retired, Army insignia on the side, chips on the handle from a decade of use. I left everything else. I drove east toward the sunrise. The light was clean and flat and very wide. I drove toward it without looking back.